So welcome officially, everyone, to our presentation today. We're going to be tackling head-on this topic of writing better IoT firmware using AI tools and services. I promise you we are going to cut through the buzzwords today and really focus on showing off some pragmatic pathways really for utilizing these tools in a variety of development scenarios using Notecard and NoteHub, of course. So we're going to be answering questions like, what even is an MCP server? What's the difference between ask and agent modes in your tools? Which tools you should even use? But maybe most importantly, kind of moving beyond that 101, right? And really getting into some more useful advanced guidance on using the AI tooling that we present. As I mentioned just before, if you have any questions during the presentation today, you can ask those in the Q&A panel. That's all in your Zoom UI. You can use the chat window as well, but I'm just telling you sometimes stuff gets lost in chat. Q&A is a little bit better way to go. We're going to actively answer as many questions as we can as we're not speaking. And if we have time at the end, we'll do more of a public Q&A session with some of the better questions. And just to head off the question that you always want to ask, is this being recorded? It is being recorded. You can find it on the Blues YouTube channel at this URL. While you're there, we always love new subscribers as well. With that, let's get our speakers introduced, starting with Alex Bucknall. Alex is our staff DevX engineer here at Blues and is actually the author of our Blues Expert MCP that we're going to be showing off. Also, TJ Vantol is here. TJ is our principal developer advocate. He's going to be helping us move beyond the basics of AI tooling, if you will. And last, and maybe least, today is me, Rob Lauer. I'll be your MC and provide some AI training wheels, I guess, to get you going today. You'll also find all of us really lingering on the Blues forum. We're there all the time. If you need any help after the webinar, you can definitely find us there. Now, a quick look at the high-level agenda today. I'm going to kick things off with a brief intro to Blues. I'm going to do another brief intro to MCP servers, a brief intro to Blues Expert, and a demo on using MCPs with ChatGPT. This is kind of more your 101 level stuff. But as mentioned, TJ is going to join us then and kind of follow up by moving beyond those basics, right, into more robust tools, robust tips, I guess. Alex is then going to join us to talk more about the advanced usage, so specifically around using AI tools like when retrofitting Notecard into an existing product, so some very useful stuff there. If time allows, I'm going to actually be back to talk about what I think is really missing in a lot of our connected projects, because frankly, it's really hard, or at least it was before AI, that being adding a really engaging visual UI to our products using a display, using the fantastic and fantastically difficult LVGL library. So more on that a little bit later. And this is a reminder to me that we have a poll for you all to fill out. So let me see if I can dig up that poll. I'm going to launch it right now. Okay, hopefully that actually worked.
Yep, I see it.
Sweet. So if you can answer that, we'll come back to that towards the end of our show as well. All right, so let's briefly talk about Blues because I did check our registrations ahead of time, and I know at least a third of you are completely new to Blues and what we are about. So let's get you caught up really quickly there. Blues starts with the Blues Note Card. Note Card enables wireless connectivity for your product, but it's not just a modem. It contains a radio, components, circuitry that all make it function as a standalone wireless connectivity module. What does it do? Well, an easy way to explain it is it occupies this boring space in the middle of your IoT product, right? The part of cloud enablement that you probably don't want to deal with. You're an expert at building your product, you're an expert at building your cloud application. We provide that seamless bi-directional connectivity between the two. Now, what generally gets people pretty stoked about the Note Card? Well, first is our cellular Note Card provides global reach. It also ships prepaid with 500 megs of data, 10 years of service. You can extend those if you need to. There's no monthly SIM fees involved with the Note Card. You can ascertain your device's location with the onboard GPS or with a feature we call Wi-Fi triangulation. You can look it up. It's built to be low power, consumes 8 to 18 microamps when idle, depending on the Note Card you are using. We'll get to those in a second. And it uses note carriers. These are carrier boards that let you effectively interface or let the Note Card interface with your chosen host MCU or SBC. Basically, you can use any MCU or SBC you want with the Note Card. Again, plenty of no card options that you can use depending on the radio that you need. These are all swappable in terms of the physical connector, that M.2 connector at the bottom, and the fact that you use one API the same way to program all note cards, allowing for mixed radios with one set of firmware running in your entire fleet. Now, NoteCard is really only half the story at Blues. The other half is our cloud service that we call NoteHub. Out of the box, NoteCard knows how to securely connect with NoteHub, regardless of the radio that it's using, immediately when you power it on. It's going to sync its data with NoteHub, and then you'll configure NoteHub to sync or route that data to your cloud application, whichever cloud app it may be, any of the big clouds, any IoT platform, and so on. Really, really easy to use bidirectional data transfers. If you haven't seen it yet, check out our developer guides at dev.blues.com. Get a better picture of everything I just kind of threw at you. All right, on to the even more fun stuff. What is the Blues Expert MCP, or even better, what is an MCP? Well, MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. It is a standard for connecting tools to LLMs like ChatGPT or Claude, or whatever it may be. It is really, I like how it's framed as like the AI equivalent of USB-C. That means like a single universal interface that lets assistants plug into external tools and data stores. So Blues Expert is one such MCP. It embeds the note card documentation, best practices, all directly into your AI assistants. It also provides access to note card design patterns, best practices, really all to get the most out of note card and note hub. It can also reduce the likelihood of AI hallucinations, which is very critical nowadays when using AI tools. So an MCP in action might look something like this. We're going to start by querying our chosen LLM with a prompt that we generate. If the LLM is not confident in its response, and if it has access to an MCP that it think can help, it'll try and use that MCP. That MCP in turn might query an API, a data store, maybe a RAG pipeline of index documentation, anything to supplement its knowledge. And that data is going to return to the LLM. You'll get a far more intelligent response, again, usually hallucination free. Now, I want to do a very quick demo of using the Blues Expert MCP directly in ChatGPT. So let me start sharing my browser window and I can give you a quick run through on this.
It's a question that just came in while you're bringing that up about who defined the MCP protocol, and it was Anthropic who makes Claude originally, but it's been shockingly widely adopted. So, as Rob's going to show, OpenAI implements it in ChatGPT, and as you're going to see, pretty much any platform that does AI now has some integration in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, so this is a really like again kind of 101 level demo. This is sort of like the ask mode. You're just asking ad hoc questions to an LLM. Um, and I'm going to start this with a great question to ask because it's a really confusing one, frankly, for everybody who starts using the note card. And that is, can you use the note card's GPS and cellular radio simultaneously? Because again, the note card does support the note card cellular does have a GPS module built in as well. I'm just going to ask the LLM this and see what kind of response we get. So it says, yes, you can use the GPS and cellular radio simultaneously. Now, that's actually wrong. It's a very easy thing to get wrong because the answer is it's more nuanced, it's more complicated. Now, this is where a good example of the oh, this is hilarious. There is a Zoom widget that I need to move to get to my settings that I can't move. Oh, there we go. I moved to the other side. Okay, that was funny for me. Okay, so if I'm going to add the MCP, if I want to use the Blues Expert MCP in ChatGPT, what I'm going to do is I'm going to head to my settings and head to apps and connectors. I need to qualify this by saying I don't know if this is limited to paid ChatGPT accounts or not. I happen to have a Plus account, which is that first level, that $20 a month. So your mileage may vary. If you scroll down, you're going to get to advanced settings. You're going to toggle developer mode on. If you head back, you'll then see this little button appear here, which lets us create a new app, a new connector, however you want to phrase it. And we're going to add the Blues Expert MCP here. So of course we need a logo. So I have the Blues logo there and we'll call it Blues Expert MCP. And then we need the URL. And this is the same MCP server you're going to use sorry, same URL you're going to use regardless of the tool that you're using. So this is a hosted MCP. There's nothing you have to install locally. There's no authentication to deal with, and we understand the risks. So I'm going to create this. It usually takes just a minute. All right. Now that we've enabled developer mode, we're going to see this very bright orange developer mode border here around our prompt. You'll note that when you're using developer mode, the memory is turned off, so ChatGPT is not going to remember these conversations, which I'm not crazy about, but it is what it is. Let's go ahead and re-ask this question using, I got to make sure I also choose to use the Blues Expert MCP. So I hit the plus icon, go to more, Blues Expert MCP. Let's ask the question again and assume this is going to work.
And it will vary as you're going to see whether the MCP has to be explicitly added or not. So some of the tools are intelligent enough that you don't have to explicitly tell it to use the MCP. And we'll try to show off that and clarify it more as we go.
And usually with these tools, we can get into the details. You can see the actual requests and response that are happening behind the scenes.
So we'll get into a bit more detail as well about what these specific tools are later on. You can see it called one and then it failed to call it and it tried another tool. There's a lot of nuance in what the MCP can do, but we'll explore that later once we move on beyond the introduction.
And just to wrap this up, just to be clear, the MCP is correct. The note card cannot operate internal GPS and cellular radios at the same time. So 1 for demos today. I'm going to pass it on to TJ.
Yeah, so I'll bring up my screen. And the main thing I want to show, so I'm starting with ChatGPT up because I feel like the reason we put this as the first slot in our presentation is because I feel like that's where a lot of us start interacting with AI when it comes to firmware stuff. And I still do use ChatGPT somewhat frequently for firmware questions back and forth, but there are some limitations if you're just working in this environment. I mean, one is that you're probably copying and paste things back and forth from whatever editor you're working with your code back into this window. But also ChatGPT, even if you add MCPs, even if you start to give it some smarts, it still doesn't have the full context of what you're working on. And the more of that sort of context and information you can provide to AI, the better firmware you're going to get out of it. Now, to switch over to here, if you're familiar with this space at all, if you work in this space at all, you're probably familiar that there are a lot of tools available. I've brought up some of the bigger ones in tabs in my browser. I see if you're like me, you're hounded around the internet with ads for AI coding tools just all the time, and it seems like there's a new one coming out every day. I'm going to try to simplify this world for you a little bit. I'm not going to go sequentially through every tool out there. I'm going to end by most of our demos are going to be in Claude Code because that is the tool that we use at Blues and that we prefer. But I'm going to give two quick shout outs to some other tools that are out there. The first I have right here, GitHub Copilot. GitHub Copilot is made by the team at Microsoft and it integrates directly into Visual Studio Code. So if you're a Visual Studio Code person, if you write firmware there, it can be a really nice integration. And they have a free tier that gives you 50 free agent requests every month. So it's just a quick, lightweight thing that you can add on and start using as part of your development. The other really popular editor that's being used for AI-based tooling is Cursor. Cursor is a VS Code fork, so it's going to feel very familiar to Visual Studio Code. And they've been working on a lot of this agentic stuff, so they have ways that you can tell your tool to run full-on commands, completely control your project that you can try out as well. And I mentioned this because Cursor also has a 1 week free trial of their Pro plan. So if you want to dive into something that's a little bit more of a professional tool, you can take that free trial and Cursor and try that out a little bit as well. But to kind of cut to the end here, what we found at Blues, and we've experimented with literally all of these, we play with these tools probably more than we should. But what we've had the best results with, what we use internally at Blues for our own firmware development is Claude Code. And we like Claude Code for, I guess, two reasons. The first is that we get the best results out of it, which is, I think, probably always the most important thing. You want to use the tool that actually writes the best firmware. But the other important thing is that it's a tool that runs based off of a terminal. You see that's what the installation instructions are here. And that's pretty important in the firmware world because depending on what you're building, you might not always be able to write your firmware in like a Visual Studio Code or a Cursor. You might have to use vendor-specific tools. Maybe you're working in Arduino IDE, or maybe you're working in some ST-based tool or some ESP-based tool or some other vendor-specific tool. So having a tool that can operate at the command line level, that can sort of dive into anything, can often be fairly important. And for those of us that have to jump into projects and different ecosystems back and forth, Claude Code is really, really nice for that. So to show it off, I've got two different demos. The first is I've just got our very intro for Blues starter. This is our sensor tutorial. If you've gone through our quick start experience before, open in Arduino IDE. So what I can do is I've navigated in my terminal to the folder where this project is located. And once you have Claude installed, you can just run it with the Claude command. And it brings up this little interface. If you're the sort of person that's a little bit intimidated by the command line, by terminals, I can say that Claude Code is pretty easy to use. You really have nothing to worry about. They guide you through things fairly easily. They make it pretty straightforward. And then once you're in, you can just start talking to it. So the basic usage is just like being in ChatGPT. So one thing that I do a lot is I just ask, what does this project do? So for example, I work in developer relations here at Blues. I see a lot of firmware projects. I see customers, users projects that are struggling with some issue. And this is something that I do a lot. I'll just dive into the project and start by having the AI explain to me what's going on here. And the cool thing about this is that Claude, because it's running on the terminal, because it can see everything, if this were a more complex project, if it had, multiple dozens, we have projects that have hundreds, thousands of files. Claude can pretty intelligently crawl through that and figure it out in a way that like a ChatGPT environment wouldn't be able to do. And you'll see it usually does pretty good with this. So it says this is an Arduino tutorial project about how to use the Blues note card. It explains it fairly well. So this mode is where you basically ask questions, but you can also ask Claude to change code, like even in environments where you don't necessarily have direct control, like Arduino IDE. I could say like add a bunch of logging and documentation and just let it go to work. Because admittedly, our starter project here, we don't do a lot to walk people through this, and we probably should. I could maybe commit this afterwards. And what you'll see here in a second, it's going to, look, it's adding like a whole bunch of stuff up to the top of this. It's adding it through here. It's going to prompt me whether I want to, basically at certain points, for permissions reasons, it doesn't necessarily make every change for you without asking you. But it is smart enough. You'll see that the first option was to do it. The second option was to do it and not ask again during this session. So typically once you do that once, it is going to be good to go. And there we go. So it's already added this big thing on top, the configuration, different things throughout it. So little things like this even can, I also, AI tools are so good for just little things like this. Like it just makes your serial logs so much nicer to view when it does things like this. So that's one thing is I do all the time is like add logging to my thing, or like maybe add a flag so that I only see the logs during development. And it's really quite good at that.
It's also worth noting, TJ, that if you like that kind of thing, you can specify in a Claude MD file to do that, and it will try to do that whenever it sees that file appear.
Look at that transition. So let's switch over to my second demo. And in this one, I'm going to build something that's a little bit more advanced. And you can see this one, I'm also just completely starting from scratch. This is the environment that I personally use for a lot of my own firmware development. So this is Visual Studio Code, which is my preferred editor just because it's really popular. It's got tons of configuration, extensions. I can kind of theme it and drag windows along to where I like. And what I typically do when I'm writing firmware is I'll have Claude over here. So this is similar to the setup I have before, but this is all just directly within Visual Studio Code, which I like, and I can just sort of drag my terminal that's running Claude to wherever I want. Now for this demo though, I'm going to show off a few more features of Claude that are going to help Claude produce better firmware, because really that's the goal at the end of the day. This is an AI tool that the more that we can tell it about what we're building and what we want out of it, the better quality firmware, the more likely that we're actually going to be able to use the firmware that comes out of this. So the first thing I'll show is, Alex alluded to this, is this Claude.markdown file. So pretty much all of these AI tools have some concept of this file. This is basically a way of providing like a system prompt or some information that Claude takes into account for every single command that it's running. So this is a great place to put guidance, like for example, code styles, the types of things that you want it to do. For me, it's like the type of indentation you prefer, the just basically little things about the code that you want it to produce, code styles, that sort of thing. The other thing I like to do in this file is tell it about the hardware I'm using. So for example, for this project, and if I can get the wiring right, I've got basically a Blues starter kit hooked up with a Blues note card, a Blues Signet microcontroller, which is STM32 based. And then I wanted to use something that I was unfamiliar with for this demo. So I busted out a sensor that I got several years ago and really haven't had much of a chance to use, is this BMP 581 sensor, which does highly accurate barometric pressure readings, which is mostly used for altitude purposes. And the main use cases for these is people use them for indoor trackers because based off pressure, you can tell like what floor somebody's on. And then also for people doing outdoorsy things, like if you're climbing mountains and you want a very accurate reading of how high you're going, this is a great sensor to use for that. But it's also a sensor that can be fairly intimidating. So if you look through, this is a sensor that's made by Bosch. It's got this GitHub repo that's very complicated, and I could figure it out, but it would take me a long time to do it. So instead, I'm going to use Claude to help me out. But by providing this context so that Claude knows about this, this is basically just background information that's there that Claude can take into account. And actually, Alex is going to show one additional tip that's even cooler when he gets to his segment. But this just basic information can make your AI a whole lot smarter. And then the second thing, so let me just launch up Claude here real quick, is that I also have Blues Expert installed. So basically, it's a one-line command. You can find it on our documentation for how to install an MCP server. And I've got Blues Expert ready to go for any requests that I make. And I'll also point out that one just small tip with Claude Code is that there are different locations that you can install an MCP server in. And if you want it to be available in all your projects, which it kind of depends on your workflow, for me, I like having Blues Expert available everywhere because of the nature of my job, because I am in lots of projects. This probably doesn't matter to you if there's just one big product that you work on, and that's the only thing. It's not a big deal. But if you do want it available everywhere, there are flags that you can do to basically orchestrate that or configure it how you would like. But all of that in mind, really, all of this is just providing better smarts so that Claude can do a better job building firmware. So let's see if it actually works. So let's see, what do I want to do? I want to say I want to read from my BMP 581 and get altitude readings every 15 seconds. Queue those readings on the note card and sync them immediately. And we'll just let it get to work. And what Claude does is, unlike ChatGPT, it's kind of smart enough to infer when to use the expert and the tools that are available in the expert automatically. So if this is working correctly, you should see a couple of tool calls. So MCP servers provide different tools, and LLMs kind of intelligently, or at least are supposed to intelligently figure out what tools that they can use as part of their development. So you'll see, for example, it calls up to this firmware entry point tool. It's also going to be, there's a tool in there for API docs for validating the requests it's going to do. If you've used LLMs to build no-card firmware specifically, you may know that these requests are the biggest things that LLMs love to hallucinate, because they'll make up things that sound interesting. Even this morning when I did a test run of this, the LLM just decided like card.template sounded like a good thing, which makes sense because it's very close to the note.template request that actually exists. But in general, it does a pretty good job, and these tools help it out. And while it's running, do we have any other questions or anything else you guys want to point out as Claude does its thing?
Somebody had a really good question. Ask if there was a template for Claude MD that we could start from, and it just made me think like this is absolutely something we should offer on our developer site. So unfortunately, the answer is no today, but we can absolutely get a starter template published.
I can add to that, Rob, as well. So while we don't have a Claude.md template at the moment, what the Blues Expert will do is it provides effectively like a Blues version of that, which it injects into your LLM's, I guess, thinking process. So while we don't currently have a defined Claude MD file at the moment, Blues Expert will do the job of influencing your code in a Blues-centric way to do best practices like how to correctly communicate with the note card, what are the best practices for waiting for it to start up, that kind of thing. We'll look at that in a little bit when I get into my demo.
The other fun thing is if you're struggling with that, one thing you can do is you can just ask Claude to build your Claude.md file, which I know feels like very cyclical, but it can do a pretty good job giving you a starter set. So in general, when you're prompting the AI, the more detail you could provide, you could. So if I was doing it, I would tell Claude, I'm building this. Well, I'll allow this. This is the type of project I'm building. This is the environment I'm in. Can you build me a reasonable Claude.md starting point? And then it'll scaffold out something that looks pretty good. And then you would go in from there and say, like, okay, this is a pretty reasonable starting point. Let me go in and sub in my own stuff.
Mhm.
So it's asking me
That's
different
really
firmware
interesting. I've
libraries I
never
want to
seen
use.
it. Sorry, TJ. I've never seen it ask which library it should use.
Yeah, it's fine to it's got different libraries, yeah, because it's funny to see the thing about these tools too is that they're non-deterministic. So every time you run through this, something different might happen. Because we're giving it a lot of info, it should work and it should come up with something, but the path that it gets there might be a little bit different.
One tip I was going to talk about when I show off my LVGL demo is actually in my instructions. I explicitly tell it which library to use for each component that I'm using, which tends to work
Mhm.
around some errors.
Yeah,
There's
I
a
did. I did too. I
Oh, you
have it in
did.
here. But so this is a good point to say that like just because you tell it to do something doesn't mean it doesn't always listen to you like a lot of AI tools, which is sometimes frustrating, but that's just the way this world works.
Very smart child.
there's a couple of QA questions that we can probably handle in one go. So I'm going to work from the top if you guys got a second while we're letting do things.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got a question asking, we use the word tools a lot. What is that in the context of MCP? So you'll have noticed if TJ looks at his terminal, scroll up a little bit perhaps, there's a couple of places like here where it says Blues Expert API Validate. So this is, if you're familiar with the concept of APIs, it's effectively an API endpoint. So the Expert is the server, and then this API Validate is an endpoint on that server. And so what the LLM has done here is it said, hey, I want to use this resource on the MCP, API validate, and it's a specific function that the the MCP provides. And so API validate here is taking in note card requests, like the API on the note card, and then confirming that what it has written in code is actually valid and legitimate. And so the MCP consumes that and goes, hey, you're using this correctly, great, or no, you're not using this, this is wrong, here's how you should be using it. So that's one of the tools, and we'll look at some more of those in a little bit. I'm just going to quickly run through these really quick. So the next one is, can it generate automatic tests for functions and check edge cases, potential code issues? Yes, it absolutely can. It's really good for doing this, particularly things like API usage. In essence, can Claude or ChatGPT use Blue's MCP server writing code? Yes, it will. And this is like what you're seeing here with TJ's example.
Yeah, and I'll just point out because it finished generating the code here. You can see that part of the reason that we recommend using Blue's MCP is that it'll basically enforce some of our best practices. So for example, it created a note file template, which helps on data usage and consistency throughout your project. It established one of those. It put all of the note card code into separate files. That's another best practice we recommend so that you can keep your main file kind of clean and have the note card stuff in there. It also didn't work on the first attempt as well. You can see that it had some errors. So I'm going to give it one go to see if it can fix it. Typically, when this happens, I'll just take the error and paste it back in here and see if it can figure it out. And we'll see if it works. And if not, we'll just move on to the next thing. But we'll give it one more go at it.
Mhm.
There's one question that came up in chat. Somebody said they're using VS Code with GitHub Copilot. Super common tool to use. Copilot does have its own, I think it's called copilot-instructions.md. So very, very similar to Claude.md.
So interestingly, did you see it actually added an I squared C scanner because it's looking for It looks like it worked this time though. We'll see if so. It's got an altitude there. Let's see if the altitude goes up when I raise this thing up in 15 seconds here. It's one thing I've seen it do is it'll add debugging code for you and then ask you what happens. So it added an I squared C scanner, and then it wants to know what I squared C addresses it can detect.
Mhm.
So my altitude went up a little bit, but not really. So it might just be I think it's still looking at the wrong place. So in any case, this is a common workflow too, where if you do have errors, the other nice thing about being here is because you have all this context here in this running conversation, usually it's able to figure it out. So I'll see if I can get this working by using the scanner, but I'm going to turn things over to Alex here.
I have one last comment, TJ, which is a tip that I've used quite a lot, which you can actually, because Claude has access to your command line, you can actually pipe in your serial logs. So I quite often use this for debugging where I will feed Claude my serial logs from my device. So say, hey, Claude, look at my logs from my device. Can you tell me what's wrong with this? And so when it's doing things like scanning the I squared C bus, it can very clearly like locate what the problem is. Obviously, you could just copy and paste it, but I find it easier to give it access to do it on its own. So it can just like run the code, compile the code, look at the code, and see what it's doing. So you create that feedback loop.
Yeah, and sometimes the from a previous run, there's some flag it needs to set for altitude that I think is where I'm going to end up getting this to because it does have the right that temperature looks very reasonable, but I think there's some flag that it's missing. But we'll check back in. I want to make sure Alex can
Mhm.
show off because he's got some cool things to show too.
So I have a retrofitting demo, but what I'm going to do quickly, because I've seen a lot of questions about like what are the tools that Blue Expert has, how do I connect to it, what do I do with it? I'm going to actually jump into a tool built by Anthropic called the MCP Inspector. I'm going to show you a breakdown of like each of the tools we currently have in the Blues Expert and how they can help you. So let me share that with you. Here we go. Okay, let me make that a little bit smaller to fit everything on screen. Okay, is
Yeah,
that
can
looking
you
good for you
bump up the
guys?
font size?
Oh yeah, let me go bigger as well. It's my big screen is causing problems.
Yeah, you're good there.
Okay, so you can see here. So this is a development tool for building MCPs. This is not so interesting from someone who wants to consume it, more about how to actually see what's inside of the MCP. You'll notice from when TJ was going through, he showed off this API validate request, and we can see there's some other tools in here that the Blues Expert has access to. And I'll preface this with we're still learning about how this works and the best practices for building MCPs. So a lot of these things may change. They may get combined. They may become new tools. Um, don't build your whole development process around it today because we are still iterating and it may change between what we do today and what we do tomorrow. But today's tools are interesting. We can have a look at them. So this API validate that TJ was using earlier, you can see this is all stuff that's provided behind the scenes to your LLM. Through the MCP inspector, we can see directly what's going on here. You can see what it does is it validates a notecard API request against the notecard API schema. So behind the scenes, we built this tool called the notecard API schema. And what that does is it is a hardened version of the notecard API, which has all of the correct usage for when you send a JSON payload. So when TJ is doing his new request in Arduino and building out his structured JSON objects, behind the scenes, that creates a JSON payload that gets sent to the notecard. And one of the big issues that I've noticed when we haven't used Blues Expert to build notecard projects with LLMs is they often hallucinate and create these crazy assumed APIs which don't exist. Like TJ was talking earlier about card.template. That isn't an API. And what this endpoint does on the MCP is actually lets you check whether that's valid or not. So I can type in here just to prove it. So we can do rec, and then let's try card.template. So we know that doesn't exist. And I can send that over to the tool. And it's taking a little bit of time because I'm running this locally at the moment. And what it's doing is it's downloading all of the schemas to confirm against it. There you go. So validation failed, unknown request type, card.template. So the LLM will have received this back, and it would know then that this isn't a valid API for the note card. Super useful for when you're writing firmware. You need to check something is actually real. It's less helpful when you know what you're doing, but more helpful when you give the LLM the wheel and it's driving it for you. In addition to this, there's something called the API docs. So this is for the node cards API, and if you want to find out specific information about a certain type of API, so in this case, we know that note.template is an API. We can run that. and find out more information specifically about what that API does. So this will all come back to your LLM behind the scenes. This won't be initially apparent to you writing code, but it will be building out this understanding of the Notecard API, and it can query the Blues expert to understand what it's doing. So here we can see there's different parameters you can pass to it. You can pass a body, a delete, a file, a format, and this will all get used as the MCP is writing code for you. Okay, so one of the more interesting tools that's available to the MCP is the doc search. And what this does is actually queries the RAG implementation we have running behind the blues.dev website. And so what a RAG is it's a document store effectively that provides the LLM with a markdown version of our dev website. And more than that, it's current and live. So anything that's on there will be embedded into this search endpoint. So when the LLM wants to check something to see how to do it, like how Rob showed earlier, using it to check whether you can use GPS and the cellular radio at the same time, it will go and query this. What the doc search expert tool does, it actually takes this one step further. It's a powerful tool that the MCP has to actually leverage your LLM to improve your queries. So when you make a request and you have the capacity to do what's called sampling on the MCP, what it will do is it will take the context that your LLM can provide to it, use your LLM to process it. So it'll take things like, if you've had a previous conversation with the LLM about what hardware you're using, what sensors you're using, which firmware libraries to use, it'll pull all that information in and then combine it with the response that was given back to it from the search query using the docs search tool and give you a really comprehensive understanding of how the thing that you've asked fits into your application. Not all tools support this. I know VS Code is a good one for this. GitHub's Copilot is good at using it. Claude Code Desktop can't use it, and I don't think Claude Code itself can use it. But it's one of these tools I wish more people would support because it's very, very powerful. And then the final two things that are worth talking about are these firmware entry point and firmware best practices tools. So firmware entry point is where your LLM will go to once it starts building a project for you. This is like, hey, how do I get started with this thing? And so within the firmware entry point, we have 4 documentation libraries. There's Node-C, Node Arduino, Node Zephyr, and Node Python. These are our common SDKs. And for each of those, it will get given back basically what we were talking about earlier with the Claude MD file. It gives it back like here's how you should use Notecard with these SDKs. And so it'll do things like, as TJ was pointing out, always use Note templates for building templates because it's bandwidth efficient and it's also the most effective way of storing data on the Notecard. It'll do things like, when you connect to the Notecard for the first time on a cold boot, you should always do a retry to make sure that you don't talk to it before it's ready to communicate. And all of this is provided back to you in this firmware entry point, which the LLM will store as it starts building your application. Beyond that, the entry point points to use the best practices tool. So this is another endpoint on the MCP, and this provides specifics like, I want to do power management, or I'd like to use sensors with the note card, or tell me more about how to use templates. And so at the moment, there's just 4 of these endpoints for each of the SDKs, but as we start building the tool out, there'll become more of them. They're particularly useful when you want to get into the weeds of like power management, or if you're trying to do specific things like conserve bandwidth for your data usage. And at some point, we'll start looking at how to add in end-to-end communication using Starno and other products that we have for doing cellular communication as failover. So while the note card's documentation is comprehensive and there's a lot out there, these tools help boil it down for the MCP to get just what it needs and to help build in a structured and controllable manner rather than overloading it. Did I miss any questions that were interesting while I was doing that?
No, I think you're good. We've had some questions coming in, but not about the tools directly. So I think you're good to go.
Okay, great. So I won't show off these because TJ's shown off some of them. I have a demo that I was going to highlight to do with retrofitting code, which I know is a question. So I'll explain that a little bit while I start it. Let me share a different screen. And where's that gone?
We did have one question come in because somebody asked why I use Claude Code from the terminal and not the extension for VS Code. And ultimately, that's just a personal preference thing. So there is, to just confuse things more, there is a Claude Code extension for Visual Studio Code that you can use if you don't want to use the terminal one. Ultimately, it's the same thing. It's just a slightly different UI on top of it. So you can play with both. I kind of just prefer the raw terminal one, just personal preference though.
Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to find. keep
I
going.
also just tossed in chat the issue with my demo was that my altitude was just off by 1,000. So once Claude from my serial logs figured out that I'm actually not at like 20,000 meters above sea level, it did that, and I'm getting more reasonable readings now also.
Okay, so here's my retrofitting demo. So we had a question earlier that was like, can you use this to add connectivity, note card connectivity to an existing project? And this has been one of our focuses recently on the tool is how can we help customers who already have projects add note card to it? It's far more common for us to hear queries of like, I'm building a thing and I want to add connectivity to it. So this is hopefully a way to address some of that. So I have a couple of pre-prepared prompts here, and this is a really basic one I'm going to use. So here we have Claude code in the middle. You've got my prompts on the right, and then we have a simple example for a BME 280, which is a pretty standard getting started sensor. It's a temperature sensor, humidity sensor, and pressure sensor.
You might need to
And
blow this up also,
I'm
just
sorry,
font size on your like 87-inch monitor or whatever you're running this on.
yeah. How is that?
Yeah, it's a lot better. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to give it the simple prompt. There's not much extra I've added to it here. I'm just saying use Blues Expert, add note card connectivity to this application, and we will tell it to go hands-free and edit automatically and go for it. So as TJ mentioned earlier, this will go ahead and do a couple of interesting things. It will go ahead and query the firmware entry point, as you can see up here. This tells it how to get started with Arduino. It's worked out this piece of Arduino code, and it will start building in a opinionated manner. So it'll start creating an external library. It will try not to tamper with the existing code. It'll try to build it in addition to it. Notecard is designed very much in this way. It can do its own thing. It has its own code processor. It's very good at managing itself. When retrofitting code, it's important for us not to tamper with the existing code. It's just a case of like, how can we add notecard connectivity in addition to all of these extra bits that you've already written? So you can see here it's created a header for the library. And this is standalone with the library itself. Keeps adding it to a new tab. And what's interesting here is you can see some of the things that we've specifically asked for. So one of the best practices we have is send request to retry. So this deals with the cold boot event with a note card when you first power it on. If you try to communicate with the note card before it's actually gone through its startup sequence, you could run into a situation where it's not ready to communicate. So without the MCP, Claude doesn't know how to do this. This has been one of the real prompts for us to build the tool is to make sure that we can supplement existing Claude knowledge with things that are very specific to Notecard. Okay, so it's working away here. It's adding some comments, and you can see if you look at the differential, all of these changes are generally not touching existing code. So there's no changes here made to existing code besides adding extra comments and then some additional bits to talk to our library. And this is just a simple example. So you can obviously take this much, much further. Your iteration time will probably have a few more steps. So if you're building a comprehensive firmware project, it may take you a couple of prompts to get to something that you like. But this shows the power of it in one single shot. It's been able to do all of this stuff to supplement the existing code example. Any other questions before I jump into a couple of my tips that I find useful for working with?
We got a very deep question, so
Okay.
let's do your tips first.
Okay. So there's two things that I like to use Claude for, and this is not specifically the MCP, this is just Claude itself. One thing I like to do is I like to share my pinouts with Claude. So if I have a microcontroller I'm using or sensors I like to use, I typically tend to screen grab a PNG of the pinout. So I'll show you what I'm talking about. So here I have a screenshot of the signet and all of its pinout. This is on a dev documentation. And what you can actually do is if you copy and paste this directly into Claude, so here you go, see I've pasted it in, I can say to Claude things like, what was my prompt I had for this? I didn't have one on here, I'll just make one up. I want to connect to the BME 280 over I2C using a signet. How can I do it? And so Claude can actually look at these images you give it, and it's actually very good at pulling text out of the images. It has an OCR tool built into it, so it can understand exactly what that image conveys, which pins do which, where they're located, and how to connect to them. So it says here, looking at the signet pinout, you have multiple I2C bus options available. Here's how to connect to your BME 280 sensor. And it's given us some of the pin options. So let's have a look and see if that's correct. So what has it said? It said on the right-hand side of the board near the bottom, yeah, we have SDA1, SCL1. That's its main suggestion, but it also suggests that we have the secondary I2C bus and the third I2C buses as well. So this is a really simple example, but if you've got a really complicated device or you've got lots of pinouts or you're even looking at schematics, Claude is very good at actually understanding what's going on in those images. And I typically tend to drop in like, a pinout for the IC I'm using and also the microcontroller I'm using. Even note card if you're building custom carrier boards or building other complicated production devices. In
I've
addition
started
to,
like
oh,
I'll
go on,
throw
TJ.
pinouts, I'll throw data sheets in my project because it's sometimes it's just including them in context exactly as Alex just showed there can be invaluable. So just little things like that can make a big difference.
Hmm. The next thing I was going to show as well was also doing the BME data sheet.
Oh, there
So
we go. Yeah.
yeah, exact same thing that TJ was saying. You can use it to reference all of the stuff in here. Rather than having to go through and search how to do a specific thing, you can say to Claude, like, read the BME 280 data sheet in the assets directory. Tell me the max operating voltage. And so it can go ahead and actually read PDFs as well, which seems like a simple thing to do, but when you give it data sheets, especially really, really long data sheets, it's very handy just to be like, hey, how do I do this thing? I don't know specifically what I'm looking for. I just want to know how to do it. And you see it's gone ahead and read that data sheet. So it's now looking for that specific question I had. While it's doing this, one other thing I really like to do with firmware when I'm writing firmware is I quite often get Claude to generate me a mermaid diagram. So if you're unfamiliar with mermaid diagrams, they are a markdown or a text-based representation of flow diagrams. So what you can ask Claude to do is, hey, can you build me a mermaid diagram of the current code flow in my project? And so what it'll do is it'll give you this really nice flow diagram of how the code you've written or the firmware you've written actually operates. And you can go in there and see, like, please highlight specifically where it communicates with note card, and it'll break off branches and trees. And you've got a really nice structure to give to, like, another engineer who's working on another project or somebody else who's trying to understand your code, reference to what it's doing without trying to give them the entire source code. So I often include that in my floor.md file. Is always, whenever you're starting a project, always create a mermaid diagram and keep it up to date with the changes that you make. So here you go. It's found the voltage from the datasheet. We shall have a little bit of time for Rob's demo. Should we move on to that? We got a couple more questions before we hit that.
We should
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, we should do it. So the questions, if Rob, you want to bring it up, we got some very deep questions. So Alex asked, "What are you spending a month in token usage?" Which I think is very funny. It is not a small amount. We do think it is worth it just because of the productivity gains we get from all of this. And a separate question that came in, like, how many hours got you to this level of proficiency of using AI? And the answer there is also quite a few, but I don't know. We're engineers. We like playing with this stuff. Like this is fun to us, seeing what these tools can do. And it's also, our job in DevRel specifically to be familiar with these tools, pass on what we can about helping all of you build really good firmware, which Rob is about to rock right here with his like 3,000 line prompts he's got.
Yeah, so I want to be clear, this is not a best practice. Like what I should have done is used a Claude MD or a Copilot instructions MD file to explain what I wanted to do. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, I wanted to show off how easily I was able to use the LVGL library, which is it's an open source SDK that lets you create visual interfaces on connected displays. But if you've ever used it, it's really complicated. I mean, if you've experience with XAML, for instance, like you might be slightly more comfortable with this, but it's a lot of coding just to draw like little widgets on the screen. I'm going to go through my prompt really quickly here. Obviously, I want to write an Arduino sketch, gets deployed to a Blues Swan. I'm using Platform IO. You can love it or hate it. We're going to integrate with a Blues note card, and this is where I get explicit with like use the Blues wireless note card library, SGP40 sensor, BME 680. I'm clear which touch display driver board I'm using and which display I'm using with the resolution, and again explicit with the libraries. Use the Blues Expert MCP. And then I get into the project requirements. So I'm going to read data from those sensors using LVGL, create a beautiful and engaging UI. So I'm pretty hand wavy with this. I want to sync accumulated notes with Notehub every 10 minutes. Make sure all the widgets are aligned properly because you get a lot of overlapping with LVGL if you're not careful. This is very specific to STM32, so this is just known issues that I've had in the past. I'm also clear about using that. In fact, I'm using an ST-Link debugger to deploy the sketch to my device. Anyway, the reason I want to show this off is so I started this at quarter past the hour. I was done in about 15 minutes. And what it did, the first time it generated the firmware, I had a compilation error. And what I did, if I can even find it here, I just pasted that compilation error back and made those fixes. Then it compiled correctly. I then deployed it to my device, and I noticed that I might not find it here, but I noticed as my display was running, I was getting a lot of static on the screen. So there was clearly there was some kind of refresh issue going on. So I had a compilation error that turned in more of like a runtime error. Claude fixed both of those for me. Then the last thing I noticed is that I was missing some legends on the axes of my display, and I'm going to show that off now too, just so you can see the final results. But I'm kind of excited because this worked really, really well. Show this camera off. Oh, it's going to be blurry. Well, I promise you I'm here. If I stick my finger in there, it'll maybe focus. Um, but you probably can't read it too well. It also looks like it's reversed for some reason. Well, that's disappointing camera view, but just so you know, it's showing those four data elements in a line chart going across the screen. At the top, it's displaying the most recent reading, and in the line chart, it's obviously more longitudinal data. But this worked. I mean, this honestly took me, like I said, 15 minutes of only like half paying attention to what was going on. So pretty exciting. The one thing I'll note is that it did make a mistake. This is very important when you're using AI tools. Uh, if you'll remember in my prompt, I asked to sync with Notehub every 10 minutes. It did use the proper periodic mode with my hub.set command for 10 minutes. However, in the loop, it also was set up a timer to check if 10 minutes had passed, and if so, issue a manual hub.sync request. So there's little things that you always need to watch out for when you're using these tooling. And
Yeah, another thing too, because we had a chat/question come in about this too. Some people were asking about, can you add automated tests? And actually, that might even be the best use case for AI. It's really good at helping you add automated tests to your system, thinking about scenarios that you might not have thought of, and helping you automate that stuff too.
Mm-hmm. I can answer the follow-on question from that, which is, have you used it with unit test frameworks such as Unity? Yes, is my answer. It's actually very powerful at that because it can then do test-driven development. And it's a good way of keeping it in check for like not making mistakes. You just have to be careful. Sometimes it doesn't create pointless tests because that also happens where it goes, hey, this is something you might need, and then it creates a useless test that doesn't do anything. So that does require some hand-holding, but once you've got a good test suite in place, it can be very powerful.
I just want to wrap up here with a couple slides here. I know this is not at all directly related to what we've been talking about, but it is just so cool. For those of you who are familiar with Blues, you probably know we launched Blues StarNote for Skylo about a year and a half ago, I believe. It is a satellite failover option that is paired with a note card. It uses Skylo's satellite constellation. I want you all know that coming up, we're going to be releasing the all-in-one note card for Skylo. This gives you cell, Wi-Fi, and satellite on a single note card device. Again, this is using Skylo's constellation. Then next year, I'm even more excited about this. We're releasing StarNote for Iridium. This is going to give you truly global satellite coverage for your note card powered product using Iridium's global constellation. This is all really exciting stuff for us. You can learn more about these options at blues.com and get notified when they get released. With that, I mean, we're just about at time here. I just want to thank everyone for attending. Thanks to TJ and Alex. This is great. I will be sending out a link to the recording later this week, probably with some additional resources as well. Of course, You can find more information on Blues Expert at our dev site at dev.blues.com. Just search for Blues Expert in the search window provided. If you're new to Blues, get started with a starter kit at shop.blues.com. Lastly, I want to mention that we have one more webinar coming up next month with our partner Voltaic Systems, and you can start registering for it here. I will caution you that I just launched that registration page. I'm pretty sure it works, but we're going to talk about solar-powered IoT, so how to right-size a solar panel for your connected product. I think it's going to be a really cool session with Voltaic. Any last minute? Oh, the poll. I wanted to mention. So the poll that you all filled out at the beginning, I don't know if you can see the responses by default. Oh no, I can share the results here. Just click the button. I just want to point out, if you feel bad that you're behind the curve on AI tooling, only 3 of you said that you're fully invested in AI, and a significant number aren't using AI tooling at all. So there's still more than enough time to get caught up here. Like it's never too late to start learning these new tools and services.
I was very skeptical at first, and now I'm like the addict.
He's a believer.
I've come completely full circle.
I think my one final beginner tip is that it's always best to write code with LLMs and not try to get them to consume too much. So my first project using LLMs was like a big, how do we build a no-code API schema project? And there was so much context to try and consume. It got overwhelming for me and the LLM. So the way to solve those problems is start small and build little bits before you get overwhelmed by everything.
Perfect. With that, again, thanks everyone for attending. We'll see you next time.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.